Hello and welcome to Chapter 6 of The Great Gatsby. As we read through today, we're going to be taking some Cornell notes for double extra credit. That is the assignment for this week that is extra credit. So as we go, be extra attentive to the red words to put on the left side of your Cornell notes for vocabulary, and be pulling the blue words from the slides to put on the right side of your Cornell notes, or provide some kind of explanation for what the meaning of the blue words are as we go. So that is a good way to get that full extra credit for, it is a double extra credit assignment worth quite a bit if you are hurting in the grade book. Here we go. About this time, an ambitious young reporter from New York had arrived one morning at Gatsby's door and asked him if he had anything to say. Anything to say about what? Inquired Gatsby politely. Why, any statement to give out. It transpired after a confused 5 minutes that the man had heard Gatsby's name around his office in a connection which he either wouldn't reveal or didn't fully understand. This was his day off, and with laudable initiative he had hurried out to see. It was a random shot, and yet the reporter's instinct was right. Gatsby's notoriety, spread about by the hundreds who had accepted his hospitality and so become authorities on his past, had increased all summer until he fell just short of being news. Contemporary legends, such as the underground pipeline to Canada, attached themselves to him. And there was one persistent story that he didn't live in a house at all, but in a boat that looked like a house and was moved secretly up and down the Long Island shore. Just why these inventions were a source of satisfaction to James Gatz of North Dakota isn't easy to say. So you want to grab the word contemporary and drop it into the left side of your Cornell notes for a vocabulary term and pull the definition. If in Google Docs, you can just right-click on the word and click Define to get a definition to pop up on your screen, and then just copy the definition straight out of there and paste it right next to the word contemporary. And then for James Gatz, North Dakota isn't easy to say. Well, that's an important note because James Gatz, that was really, or at least legally, his name. So that's actually Gatsby's name, like his OG name from when he was a kid. He had changed it at the age of 17, and at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career, when he saw Dan Cody's yacht drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. It was James Gatz who had been loafing along the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants. But it was already Jay Gatsby who borrowed a rowboat, pulled out the Tuolumne, and informed the Cody that a wind might catch him and break him up in half an hour. So Gatsby meets this yachting dude. He's just like vibing alongside the water on Lake Superior, one of the Great Lakes, and this dude pulls up in a yacht, and it's a stormy day, and it's this drunk old dude in a yacht named Dan Cody, and he's like super rich, and Gatsby, at this time still James Gatz, rows out to tell this dude, hey, you need to like pull your boat in or else it's going to get destroyed. I suppose he'd had the name ready for a long time. Even then, his parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his Platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that, and he must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and to this conception he was faithful to the end. All right, a couple things. Grab the word Platonic, drop it into the left side, and pull your definition. In the blue, his parents were shiftless. Basically, Gatsby's parents were really poor farmers out west, and he never really identified with them. He saw them as not his parents. He felt like he was destined for bigger things than farming out west. And what bigger things specifically? Well, he saw himself as, quote unquote, a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. So he feels like kind of Christ-like. He needs to be about his father's business, meaning like the business of God. I think like I'm on a mission from God style thing from like the Blues Brothers. For over a year, he'd been beating his way along the south shore of Lake Superior as a clam digger and a salmon fisher, or in any other capacity that brought him food and bed. His brown, hardening body lived naturally through the half-fierce, half-lazy work of the bracing days. He knew women early, and since they spoiled him, he became contemptuous of them. Of young virgins because they were ignorant, of the others because they were hysterical about things which in his overwhelming self-absorption he took for granted. So Gatsby got around. Gatsby was effectively kind of a player during his pre-Daisy's days. But his heart was in a constant turbulent riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. A universe of ineffable gaudiness spun itself out in his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand and the moon soaked with wet light his tangled clothes upon the floor. Each night he added to the pattern of his fancies until drowsiness closed down upon some vivid scene with an oblivious embrace. For a while these reveries provided an outlet for his imagination. They were a satisfactory hint of the unreality of reality, a promise that the rock of the world was founded securely on a fairy's wing. I saw a really flowery description there. Make sure you grab the word ineffable for the left side. But also, we're talking here about how Gatsby is kind of like haunted by these dreams of greatness. His heart was in a constant riot. Fantastic conceits haunted him at night. A universe of ineffable gaudiness being like wealth, spinning out in his brain at night. An instinct toward his future glory had led him, some months before, to the small Lutheran college of St. Olaf in southern Minnesota. He stayed there 2 weeks, dismayed at its ferocious indifference to the drums of his destiny, to destiny itself, and despising the janitor's work with which he was to pay his way through. Then he drifted back to Lake Superior and was still searching for something to do on the day that Dan Cody's yacht dropped anchor in the shallows along the shore. It's like a yacht, like Dan Cody's yacht, it's just like a giant boat. Cody was 50 years old then, a product of the Nevada silver fields, of the Yukon, of every rush for metal since '75. The transactions in Montana copper that made him many times a millionaire found him physically robust but on the verge of soft-mindedness, and suspecting this, an infinite number of women tried to separate him from his money. The none too savory ramifications by which Ella Kay, the newspaper woman, tried to separate him, played Madame de Montignon to his weakness and sent him to sea in a yacht were common knowledge to the turgid journalism of 1902. He'd been coasting along all too hospitable shores for 5 years when he turned up as James Gats's destiny at Little Girl Bay. To the young Gats, resting on his oars and looking up at the railed deck, the yacht represented all the beauty and glamour in the world. I suppose he smiled at Cody. He had probably discovered that people liked him when he smiled. At any rate, Cody asked him a few questions, one of which elicited the brand new name, James J. Gatsby, and found that he was quick and extravagantly ambitious. A few days later, he took him to Duluth and brought him a blue coat, 6 pair of white duck trousers, and a yachting cap. And when the Tuolumne left for the West Indies and the Barbary Coast, Gatsby left too. He was employed in a vague personal capacity. While he remained with Cody, he was in turn steward, mate, skipper, secretary, and even jailer, for Dan Cody sober knew what lavish doings Dan Cody drunk might soon be about, and he provided for such contingencies by reposing more and more trust in Gatsby. Basically, that's just a really fancy way to say that Dan Cody's a super rich old drunk guy who, when he got way drunk, would have Gatsby basically lock him in his cabin so that he couldn't jump over the side or crash the boat. The arrangement lasted 5 years, during which the boat went 3 times around the continent. It might have lasted indefinitely, except for the fact that Ella Kay came on board one night in Boston, and a week later, Dan Cody inhospitably died. Yeah, so this lady, Ella Kay, who is pretty clearly being set up as a gold digger personality, comes on board the yacht, and then a week later, Dan Cody just straight up and dies. Probably poisons. That's pretty much what's being hinted at here. I remember the portrait of him up in Gatsby's bedroom, a gray, florid man with a hard, empty face, the pioneer debauchee, who during one phase of American life brought back to the eastern seaboard the savage violence of the frontier brothel and saloon. It was indirectly due to Cody that Gatsby drank so little. Sometimes in the course of gay parties, women used to rub champagne into his hair. For himself, he formed the habit of letting liquor alone. And it was from Cody that he inherited money. A legacy of $25,000. But he didn't get it. He never understood the legal device that was used against him, but what remained of the millions went intact to Ella Kay. He was left with his singularly appropriate education. The vague contour of J. Gatsby had filled out to the substantiality of a man. All right, 2 things. Grab substantiality for the left. And also, Gatsby was supposed to get money when Cody died, but the one gold digger lady, Ella Kay, got it all. Also, or what Gatsby did get, though, was the ability to act rich. He gained the ability to talk and sound wealthy, even though he was basically born as like a dirt farmer. Like he learned how to speak in a wealthy way. He told me all this very much later, but I put it down here with the idea of exploding those first wild rumors about his antecedents, which weren't even faintly true. Moreover, he told me at a time of confusion, when I had reached the point of believing everything and nothing about him. So I take advantage of this short halt, while Gatsby, so to speak, caught his breath, to clear this set of misconceptions away. It was a halt, too, in my association with his affairs. For several weeks I didn't see him or hear his voice on the phone. Mostly I was in New York, trotting around with Jordan and trying to ingratiate myself with her senile aunt. But finally I went over to his house one Sunday afternoon. I hadn't been there 2 minutes when somebody brought Tom Buchanan in for a drink. I was startled, naturally, but the really surprising thing was that it hadn't happened before. They were a party of three on horseback, Tom and a man named Sloane and a pretty woman in a brown riding habit who had been there previously. "I'm delighted to see you," said Gatsby, staying on his porch. "I'm delighted that you dropped in." So, like, Tom and, like, a couple other folks ride up to Gatsby's house, as though they cared. "Sit right down. Have a cigarette or cigar." He walked around the room quickly, ringing bells. "I'll have something to drink for you in just a minute." He was profoundly affected by the fact that Tom was there, but he would be uneasy anyhow until he had given them something, realizing in a vague way that that was all they came for. Mr. Sloane wanted nothing. "A lemonade? No, thanks. A little champagne? Nothing at all, thanks. I'm sorry." "Did you have a nice ride?" "Very good roads around here." "I suppose the automobiles." So make sure you grab the word profoundly. Basically, Gatsby allows them all into his house, and he's like trying to offer them something. "Yeah." Moved by an irresistible impulse, Gatsby turned to Tom, who had accepted the introduction as a stranger. "I believe we've met somewhere before, Mr. Buchanan." "Oh, yes," said Tom, gruffly polite, but obviously not remembering. "So we did, I remember very well." "About 2 weeks ago." "That's right, you were with Nick here." "I know your wife," continued Gatsby, almost aggressively. Alright, so that's a blue because that's an important moment where Gatsby's like straight up gonna start pushing the point that he is in love with Daisy, he's in love with Tom's wife. "That's so." Tom turned to me. "You live near here, Nick?" "Next door." "That's so." So Tom's starting to put things together in his kind of slow way. He's starting to realize, this guy knows my wife. This guy lives next door to Nick. Mr. Sloane didn't enter into the conversation, but lounged back haughtily in his chair. The woman said nothing either, until unexpectedly after 2 highballs she became cordial. "We'll all come over your next party, Mr. Gatsby," she suggested. "What do you say?" "Certainly, I'd be delighted to have you." "It'd be very nice," said Mr. Sloane, without gratitude. "Well, I think I ought to be starting home." "Please, don't hurry," Gatsby urged them. He had control of himself now, and he wanted to see more of Tom. Why don't you stay for supper?" "I wouldn't be surprised if some other people dropped in from New York." "You come to supper with me," said the lady enthusiastically. "Both of you." This included me. Mr. Sloane got to his feet. "Come along," he said, but to her only. "I mean it," she insisted. "I'd love to have you. Lots of room." Gatsby looked at me questioningly. He wanted to go, and he didn't see that Mr. Sloane had determined that he shouldn't. "I'm afraid I won't be able to," I said. "Well, you come," she urged, concentrating on Gatsby. Mr. Sloane murmured something close to her ear. "We won't be late if we start now," she insisted aloud. "I haven't got a horse," said Gatsby. "I used to ride the army, but I've never bought a horse. I'll have to follow you in my car. Excuse me for just a minute." The rest of us walked out on the porch, where Sloane and the lady began an impassioned conversation aside. "My God, I believe the man's coming," said Tom. "Doesn't he know she doesn't want him?" So Gatsby is not rich. Not really. He's fake rich. Like, he's a front man for the mob. So he learned how to act rich from Dan Cody, as Nick just explained to us. Tom's saying he's pointing out the fact that Gatsby's not picking up on the very subtle hint that he is not welcome at this lady's house. She's just being polite. She's just being like super rich, wealthy, polite, and saying, "Oh, I'd love to have you over." But really, none of them want to see each other. All right, that's the first 15 minutes of this lesson, and comes in right at 15 minutes. If you wanted to pause here and finish with another 15-minute session at a later date, that is cool. If you want to just continue to muscle through and listen to the rest of the chapter, that is also cool. Thanks for coming along. We are still working on these Cornell notes. On the left side of your notes, you should be getting these red word vocabulary terms and their definitions using the definition function in Google Docs. All you got to do is right-click on the word and choose the define word option, and it will give you a definition, which is pretty nice. And on the right side of the document, you should be putting the blue words and their explanations, or just your thoughts as the chapter goes by. She says she does want him, says Nick. She has a big dinner party, and he won't know a soul there. Tom frowned. I wonder where the devil he met Daisy. By God, I may be old-fashioned in my ideas, but women run around too much these days to suit me. They meet all kinds of crazy fish. That is like the most hypocritical thing possible. Tom is like the definition of like he sleeps around all the time. He's having an affair on his wife with Myrtle Wilson from the Valley of Ashes, George Wilson's wife. No, it's like the most hypocritical take for Tom. Suddenly, Mr. Sloane and the lady walked down the steps and mounted their horses. Come on, said Mr. Sloane to Tom. We're late. We've got to go. And then to me, tell him we couldn't wait, will you? Tom and I shook hands. The rest of us exchanged a cool nod, and they trotted quickly down the drive, disappearing under the August foliage, just as Gatsby, with hat and light overcoat, had come to the door. Tom was evidently perturbed at Daisy's running around alone, for the following Saturday night he came with her to Gatsby's party. Okay, so that's important for two reasons. One, Tom is starting to become suspicious about the nature of Daisy and Gatsby's relationship, and he shows up at one of Gatsby's parties with Daisy. Perhaps his presence gave the evening its peculiar quality of oppressiveness. It stands out in my memory from Gatsby's other parties that summer. They were the same people, or at least the same sort of people, the same profusion of champagne, the same many-colored, many-keyed commotion. But I felt an unpleasantness in the air, a pervading harshness that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps I'd merely grown used to it, grown to accept West Egg as a world complete in itself, with its own standards and its own great figures, second to nothing because it had no consciousness of being so. And now I was looking at it again, through Daisy's eyes. It is invariably saddening to look through new eyes at things upon which you have expended your own powers of adjustment. Two things. Grab profusion for the left side of your Cornell notes, and it's invariably saddening to look through new eyes at things which you've expended your own powers of judgment, of adjustment. Basically, like Nick saying that when Daisy looked at the party, it changed the way he looked at the party too, and he felt a little bit less like excited about being there. Or it's like that episode where SpongeBob works for the chum bucket instead of the this grill is not my home. It wasn't right. I guess it's kind of like that. They arrived at twilight, and as we strolled out among the sparkling hundreds, Daisy's voice was playing murmurous tricks in her throat. These things excite me so, she whispered. If you want to kiss me any time during the event, Nick, just let me know and I'll be glad to arrange it for you. Just mention my name or present a green card. I'm giving out green. Look around, suggested Gatsby. I'm looking around. I'm having a marvelous... You must see the faces of many people you've heard about. Tom's arrogant eyes roamed the crowd. So make sure you grab arrogant, but also like, man, Nick and Fitzgerald by proxy, they'd never let up on describing Tom as arrogant or powerful. That's just like his characters for Nick and for Fitzgerald, the author. Oh, arrogant eyes. I have Robert Downey Jr. doing a good arrogant gaze. We don't go around very much, he said. In fact, I was just thinking I don't know a soul here. Perhaps you know that lady. Gatsby indicated a gorgeous, scarcely human orchid of a woman who sat in state under a white plum tree. Tom and Daisy stared, with that peculiarly unreal feeling that accompanies the recognition of a hitherto ghostly celebrity of the movies. She's lovely, said Daisy. The man bending over her is her director. He took them ceremoniously from group to group. Mrs. Buchanan and Mr. Buchanan. And after an instant's hesitation, he added, the polo player. So much shade. I love it. Gatsby's introducing Tom as a polo player, which is what he did like in high school. Oh no, objected Tom quickly. Not me. But evidently the sound of it pleased Gatsby, for Tom remained the polo player for the rest of the evening. So Gatsby's like introducing this dude who he absolutely hates, basically like the guy who once did something in high school. And like that's all Tom's ever done in Gatsby's eyes. And to be fair, I don't think Tom has a job other than being rich and having inherited money. I've never met so many celebrities, Daisy exclaimed. I like that man, what was his name, with a sort of blue nose. Gatsby identified him, adding that he was a small producer. Well, I liked him anyhow. Yeah, we're just introducing Tom as the polo player to like throw shade on him. I'd a little rather not be the polo player, said Tom pleasantly. I'd rather look at all these famous people in oblivion. Daisy and Gatsby danced. I remember being surprised by his graceful, conservative foxtrot. I had never seen him dance before. Then they sauntered over to my house and sat on the steps for half an hour, while at her request I remained watchfully in the garden. In case there's a fire or a flood, she explained, or any act of God. Tom appeared from his oblivion as we were sitting down to supper together. Do you mind if I eat with some people over here, he said. A fellow's getting off some funny stuff. Go ahead, answered Daisy genially. And if you want to take down any addresses, here's my little gold pencil. She looked around after a moment and told me the girl was common but pretty, and I knew that except for half an hour she'd been alone with Gatsby, she wasn't having a good time. So basically, a couple things are going on in that first paragraph. One, Daisy's not having a great time at this party, other than when she's with Gatsby, because the girl was common but pretty. Tom is trying to hook up with somebody at this party. And Daisy, with the golden pencil, is digging at Tom by saying, basically, you might meet someone important here, as in you're not important. But she's saying that to Tom, her husband, like, hey, take this pencil, you might meet somebody important at this party where that Gatsby has thrown. There's just like a lot going on there. The whole common but pretty thing is totally her talking to Nick about Tom trying to hook up with some lady at the party. We were at a particularly tipsy table. That was my fault. Gatsby had been called to the phone, and I'd enjoyed these same people only 2 weeks before. But what had amused me then turned septic in the air now. How do you feel, Miss Baedeker? The girl addressed was trying unsuccessfully to slump against my shoulder. At this inquiry, she sat up and opened her eyes. Yeah. So Daisy, Gatsby, and Nick kind of go off, and Tom goes to hang out with some people. What? A massive and lethargic woman, who had been urging Daisy to play golf with her at the local club tomorrow, spoke in Miss Baedeker's defense. Oh, she's all right now. When she's had 5 or 6 cocktails, she always starts screaming like that. I tell her she ought to leave it alone. I do leave it alone, affirmed the accused hollowly. We heard you yelling, so I said to Doc Sibbett here, there's somebody that needs your help, Doc. She's much obliged, I'm sure, said another friend without gratitude. But you got her dress all wet when you stuck her head in the pool. So somebody calls for a medic for this lady who's gotten really drunk. Anything I hate is to get my head stuck in a pool, mumbled Miss Baedeker. They almost drowned me once over in New Jersey. Then you ought to leave it alone, countered Dr. Sibbett. Speak for yourself, cried Miss Baedeker violently. Your hand shakes. I wouldn't let you operate on me. It was like that. Almost the last thing I remember was standing with Daisy and watching the moving picture director and his star. They were still under the white plum tree, and their faces were touching, except for a pale, thin ray of moonlight between. It occurred to me that he'd been very slowly bending toward her all evening to attain this proximity, and even while I watched, I saw him stoop one ultimate degree and kiss at her cheek. I like her, said Daisy. I think she's lovely. But the rest offended her, and inarguably, because it wasn't a gesture but an emotion. She was appalled by West Egg, this unprecedented place that Broadway had begotten upon a Long Island fishing village, appalled by its raw vigor that chafed under the old euphemisms, and by the too obtrusive fate that herded its inhabitants along a short cut from nothing to nothing. She saw something awful in the very simplicity she failed to understand. That's a dense paragraph there, but basically Daisy is old money, the same way that Tom is old money, and most of the people at Gatsby's parties are new money. They're Hollywood money, they're mafia money, they're bonds and stock market money. They're not old inherited money the way that Daisy and Tom are. So Daisy is kind of disgusted by the speed at which these people live, who are all these new money folks. I sat on the front steps with them while they waited for their car. It was dark here in front. Only the bright door sent 10 square feet of light volleying out into the soft black morning. Sometimes a shadow moved against the dressing room blind above. gave way to another shadow, an indefinite procession of shadows, who rouged and powdered in an invisible glass. "Who is this Gatsby, anyhow?" demanded Tom suddenly. "Some big bootlegger?" He's like 1,000% right, but like nobody says that out loud. "Where'd you hear that?" I inquired. "I didn't hear it. I imagined it. A lot of these newly rich people are just big bootleggers, you know." "Not Gatsby," I said shortly. He was silent for a moment. The pebbles of the drive crunched under his feet. "Well, he certainly must have strained himself to get this menagerie together." A breeze stirred the gray haze of Daisy's fur collar. "At least they're more interesting than the people we know," she said with an effort. "You didn't look so interested." "Well, I was." Tom laughed and turned to me. "Did you notice Daisy's face when that girl asked her to put her under a cold shower?" Daisy began to sing with the music in a husky, rhythmic whisper, bringing out a meaning in each word that it had never had before, and would never have again. When the melody rose, her voice broke up sweetly, following it, in a way contralto voices have, and each change tipped out a little of her warm, human magic upon the air. "Lots of people come who haven't been invited," she said, suddenly. "That girl hadn't been invited. They simply forced their way in, and he's too polite to object." "I'd like to know who he is and what he does," insisted Tom, "and I think I'll make a point of finding out." "I can tell you right now," she answered. "He owned some drug stores, a lot of drug stores. He built them up himself." The dilatory limousine came rolling up the drive. "Good night, Nick," said Daisy. "Basically, he does own drug stores. That's right. He's effectively the front man for all these drug stores." I have no idea what this GIF is or what is going on in the background of this. I think it's a limousine. I think it's actually like a limousine that's like got a horse. I don't know what this GIF is. Whatever. Anyways, it's probably a good goof from like 4 years ago. The Gatsby does own a whole bunch of drugstores, but they're fronts, and they were used as fronts for distributing illegal alcohol at the time. You gotta remember, like all these people getting drunk at these parties, all that's illegal. But because they're super wealthy and it's done on Long Island, the police effectively are there, but they're also taking part. "Good night, Nick," said Daisy. Her glance left me and sought the lighted top of the steps where 3 o'clock in the morning, a neat, sad little waltz of that year, was drifting out the open door. After all, in the very casualness of Gatsby's party there were romantic possibilities totally absent from her world. What was it up there in the song that seemed to be calling her back inside? What would happen now in the dim, incalculable hours? Perhaps some unbelievable guest would arrive, a person infinitely rare and to be marveled at, some authentically radiant young girl who, with one fresh glance at Gatsby, one moment of magical encounter, would blot out those 5 years of unwavering devotion. So like Daisy kind of looks back up at the house that she's leaving, and they're leaving a little bit early in the evening, so there's still like a lot of party left. And Daisy looks back and she has this moment of concern. Like there are all these fascinating people there. Can she still hold Gatsby's heart against all these people? I stayed late that night. Gatsby asked me to wait until he was free, and I lingered in the garden until the inevitable swimming party had run up, chilled and exalted from the black beach, until the lights were extinguished in the guest rooms overhead. When he came down the steps at last, the tanned skin was drawn unusually tight on his face, and his eyes were bright and tired. "She didn't like it," he said immediately. "Of course she did. She didn't like it," he insisted. "She didn't have a good time." He was silent, and I guessed at his unutterable depression. "I feel far away from her," he said. "It's hard to make her understand." "You mean about the dance?" Yeah, so Gatsby's like struggling because Daisy obviously didn't have a great time. The dance? He dismissed all the dances he'd given with a snap of his fingers. "Old sport, the dance is unimportant." He wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, "I never loved you." After she had obliterated 3 years with that sentence, they could decide upon the more practical measures to be taken. One of them was that after she was free, they were to go back to Louisville and be married from her house, just as if it were 5 years ago. "And she doesn't understand," he said. "She used to be able to understand. We'd sit for hours." So Gatsby wants Daisy to basically destroy her own marriage, to break it off with Tom, to be with him. But there are a lot of structures in place to keep Daisy from seeing that as a viable choice, or as a safe choice even, for her or for her daughter. He broke off and began to walk up and down a desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. "I wouldn't ask too much of her," I ventured. "You can't repeat the past." Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before, he said, nodding determinedly. She'll see. Yeah, so like Gatsby is dead set on basically rewinding time to before Daisy met Tom. He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. One autumn night, 5 years before, they had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling, and they came to a place where there were no trees and the sidewalk was white with moonlight. They stopped here and turned toward each other. Now it was a cool night, with that mysterious excitement in it which comes at the two changes of the year, spring and fall. The quiet lights in the houses were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and bustle among the stars. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalk really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it, if he climbed alone, and once there he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. Basically, Gatsby saw that he could go far, but he would have to go alone. His heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Through all he said, even through his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I had heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. But they made no sound, and what I had almost remembered was uncommunicable forever. All right, so the gold here, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. Basically, Gatsby is the American dream, right? Like he functions as it. He's born to like a stud farmer family out west. He meets this dude. He learns how to act rich. He's not really rich. He's tied up in a lot of shady dealings, but he has effectively got like this big gold house that he lives in, and he just wants to get the girl though. Like because he just wants to get the girl, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. He will forever wed his visions to her perishable breath. Her perishable breath, meaning like she could die, like she is a finite thing for him to put his infinite dream into. All right, this is a collection of questions that you could have. You could use these in your Cornell notes as your questions because you're supposed to include questions in your Cornell notes. Make sure that you have your vocabulary on the left side of your Cornell notes and some blue word breakdowns on the right side of your Cornell notes. Thank you very much for listening to this reading of Chapter 6 of The Great Gatsby with a discussion built in. I hope you have a good one, and we came in right under 34 minutes. Have a good one. Bye.